Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Research Community Manager for Sage MethodSpace, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Garima Sharma and Tima Bansal. And we're going to talk about their article called Partnering Up, Including Managers as Research Partners in Systematic Reviews. But before we get started, if you're new to MethodSpace, this is a blog community sponsored by Sage Publishing. And we're interested in everything to do with designing, planning, conducting research, writing about it, and sharing results in all different kinds of ways. And you can see at the heart of this diagram, we have teaching and learning, because we think that whether you are a brand new researcher or an experienced researcher, we all have something to learn. And that's certainly been my experience in having the opportunity to do these kinds of interviews. We're talking today as a part of this series focusing on articles included in a special collection in the Organizational Research Methods Journal about review research. But to get started, why don't you introduce yourselves?
Sounds great. Thanks, Janet. Thank you for having us and this opportunity to talk about the paper. It was published a couple of years ago, but still sort of very fresh in our minds. We are using it. We're talking about it. So it's great to be able to do that here again. I'm Garima. I'm an assistant professor at Kogod School of Business at American University. I'm a sustainability researcher. I'm interested in how businesses sort of focus both on purpose and profits. And a big piece of that puzzle is to bring actors from different communities together, such as researchers and managers, so that we're able to together address big challenges like climate change.
Thanks, Janet. And I just want to echo Garima's comments. That's really a pleasure to be here. I am a professor at the Ivey Business School. My name's Tima Bansal. It's at Western University in London, Canada. I've been researching sustainability issues for over 30 years, and particularly interested in the last 25 years or so at bridging that space between research and practice, hopefully having an impact, having research impact on practice.
I know these are very important issues to our readers. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us, because engaging with managers, practitioners, professionals is really important in lots of kinds of research. So, to begin with, talking about this particular article, you distinguish between traditional and systematic reviews. And say, unlike literature reviews, systematic reviews aim to synthesize all, not just summarize selected studies, to provide a complete picture of the research landscape. So how can new researchers or researchers who haven't done this kind of a study move towards more synthesis?
That's a great question, and I'll tackle that one. The difference between traditional research or summarizing research versus systematic reviews or synthesizing is that in traditional research, what we would do is just research a topic, collect all the articles on the topic, and then summarize based on the topics that the researchers give. And so we'd say Smith and Jones and have said this, and so said that, and so said that. That's a summary of the research.
Right.
What we do when we synthesize research, we flip it on its head, and then we categorize the research in a meaningful way. And so then we lead with a topic that's of interest. So if we want to talk about how do you change systems, then what you'd want to do is try to answer the question of how you change systems by synthesizing the ways in which one can change systems, rather than in traditional ways just to summarize each of the articles.
And I'm going to quickly add to that. So in a bit, we're going to talk about the paper, and sort of I was fortunate to be able to observe and collect data on systematic review projects that, we studied, Tima and I studied. And Tima was, in many ways involved in those projects because those projects were coming out of this nonprofit called Network for Business Sustainability at Ivy Business School that Tima sort of founded and led at that time. And I remember this moment of aha, both for myself as a participant observer and for the researchers involved in the systematic review process, where Tima sort of took them through this, how do you abstract out of the weeds? And what is the value you are bringing to the conversation in terms of creating either a framework or a set of questions that others can answer. So I think this sort of abstraction and sort of what value am I adding as an author of a systematic review process is really also key to separate a regular review, I think, from a systematic review.
But it seems to me that, I mean, this kind of research, generally you have the chance to really build on and look at how to move something forward. I know that you, like all of us, we get the tables of contents of the new journals, and all the research keeps coming out. Well, what does it all mean? How can we understand it and really then say, well, what do we need to do next? So to me, this is a really important point that I think will be helpful to our methods-based readers to think about, not just looking at what's been done and kind of adding it all up, but saying, well, what lens am I taking when I look at this, and how can I take it to the next level? So it seems like it gives us a chance to really value the research that others have done.
If I could just add on that too, sorry, Karima. The thing that motivated this approach that we took, it was almost like this insight that I gained really early on. So the Network for Business Sustainability was founded about 24 years ago, so it's been around for a while. But at that insight point was when research studies are done, they're often very narrow, just by the nature of research. That we need to be very clear about the constructs that we're using. We need to very clearly dive deep into an area. But that doesn't answer the questions that managers have, which are really big and vague questions in many ways. And so a systematic review allows us to get that body of research around a question that can actually answer what they need to have answered. Because any single one research study will not be able to help them. And so what a systematic review is able to do, and why it's important for the community of practice, is that it allows us then to get the body of work around that. And I just want to say that's one thing that's different from social science systematic reviews and natural sciences, is that natural science systematic reviews often just try to validate a single result.
I see.
So what is the value of exercise to health or something like that? And they'll see all these studies that show exactly that one point. We, on the other hand, have a broad range of studies that allow us to actually navigate a bigger space. And being able to communicate that to the community of practice, that this is what we know about the whole space, really has resonance with that community.
Right. Well, I'm glad that you bring that up in terms of that bridge to practice, because that's something that's really, I think, the contribution that your article makes. And you talk about how can researchers and managers navigate the tensions related to the difference in their knowledge systems to create more impactful systematic reviews. So, tell us a little bit about, how you go about, engaging with managers or other kinds of stakeholders, in this process.
I could take that. So I'll probably talk about it, obviously, specifically in the context of our paper. And if you would sort of just indulge me for a few minutes, I want to take you through a couple of data points that can really illustrate. So as I was sort of saying a minute ago, the data for this project comes from Network for Business Sustainability and or NBS. And what NBS would do is it'll bring researchers and managers together to conduct a systematic review on a topic of relevance to practice. So for example, how do you embed sustainability in organizational culture? And so experts in research on culture and sustainability and functional experts from practice or managers who have sort of experienced that would come together. So I'm going to sort of share my screen to give you a little bit of insight into what that would look like. So this is what NBS did, was that it took a well-established sort of method of systematic review, which has 3 different phases and stages within each phase. It took that, and what it did was overlay or introduce managers at each stage of that. So, traditionally, a researcher would be executing each stage by herself, but in this case, a team of managers joined at every stage. So what you can see is sort of a 6 to 8 month process, and they would meet monthly to discuss the outputs of the systematic review process at each step. So what I'm going to show you and the viewers is sort of how we came up with some of the best practices or insights into how to make these reviews or this collaboration generative or fruitful. And I'm going to do that by first showing what everybody talks about is this tension between research and practice, right? So that we come from different worlds, we talk different language, and sort of when we come together, we talk past each other. I'm going to show you that, and then I'm going to show you moments where magic was happening and this tension was not present. And by comparing those, we are able to sort of come up with these best practices. So in this particular, data bite that I'm showing you, what researchers did is that they came up with this framework on studies around long-term thinking in management. That was the topic of the systematic review. What is in here is not important, but what I want to set the stage for is that they showed this framework based on the preliminary review of the literature. And here is what I really want to tell you how that went. So everybody's sitting in this room and managers see this framework. And now one manager says, you build this framework by putting in buckets what you're finding. Is there a filter that would be applied to this? Because every industry has a different definition of time. So managers are thinking in terms of context, in terms of industry. So the researcher says, we cannot go too far into industry specifics. We're abstracting out. Those kind of details can really bog us down. Industry differs so much. So the manager is trying again. She's saying, okay, maybe we cannot get to industry company specific, but what I'm saying is not everybody has the same definition of long-term. So now the researcher gets even more frustrated, and he says, I think it's worth mentioning that some of what you're looking for may not actually be written about or not written rigorously. What we're updating you is based on what we have seen in the literature. So what do we get from here? We get that there was sort of this inflexibility to change ideas that the researchers show, because, sort of not being able to accept, the feedback. Managers were passively either listening or they were failing to contribute or change anything in the conversation. And this idea of updating or informing managers of the progress indicated to everybody in the room that the researchers have already done their work and they're reporting back. So there's no opportunity to build on ideas or change. So in contrast to that, I want to show you another interaction in which what researchers did is that they came out into the meeting with this example where they took their conceptual framework, the 2 axes, and they put the example of drafting a baseball team. And so here's the researchers sort of introducing the example and saying, we have used the analogy of a baseball to discuss if our conceptual framework is clear. Are there confusing terms? I would like to replace this example from stuff from your business. So that now managers start getting excited. The first manager said, oh, I looked and I went baseball. I said, wow, that shot me out of left field. So I'm continuing the example there. But because it's not your industry, you can actually look at it objectively and say, I get that. So the other manager takes it even further. And she says, it's very easy to understand the conceptual trade-offs that you've been talking about, but it gets more complicated in an organizational situation. Now she rolls up her sleeve and she says, let me try to develop an example from my own company. So what's happening here is that researchers are not giving all the answers. They're asking questions of the managers, which allows the managers to actively contribute. And both parties are able to sort of modify the concepts that are being presented. And because they're presented as an example, they're indicating that this work is incomplete and sort of inviting managers to build that. So what we did is that we compared many such moments across projects, and we came up with this table that you'll find in the paper, in which we have each stage of the systematic review, each step. We write what researchers' interest or focus was managers' interest and focus was, what was really the tension, and what was the practices to navigate those tensions. And this is really sort of the key to our crux of our paper that others can learn from. In fact, we sort of took that practice column and we created that into an infographic that you see on the right, as well as other outputs like videos and blog posts. So that infographic is really almost like a cheat sheet that other researchers can use in terms of best practices and tips for such collaborations.
Well, I think, you give a couple of, important points that strike me. I mean, one is, and having worked with doctoral students myself for a number of years, I felt like, as you become a scholar, you have to learn the language of scholarship and the ways that we, frame knowledge. Well, yes, it was in the literature. Someone else has studied this, so therefore, I'm not just making this up. And that's what, we're rooted in that. And so we speak in that, with that language, and we write in that way, which can be very distracting to someone, who is not in academia. Like, why are there all these lists of, parentheses with, things in them? Like, what are you talking about? So it's almost like then we, once, to be a confident scholar, I think about the difference in the two researcher examples you give, the confidence that you have and the ability to then kind of translate the other direction to say, well, this kind of, the way that we talk as scholars is not understandable or not useful to people who are in the field, where the problems are pressing, especially now. I think, the problems you described at the beginning of when you're introducing yourselves, these are pressing problems. We don't want to wade through all this stuff. Let's get to the point, and how can we engage? So I love the way that you describe that. I think that's very, very useful. How do you as researchers, or for other researchers doing this, prepare, for those kinds of meetings? I mean, how did you come up with the idea of the baseball versus the, well, let us tell you what was in the literature? And they're thinking, I've got things to do. I've got places to go. Like, what am I doing here?
Before I answer that, Janet, I also want to say that often the conversations around research impact sort of turn into what are the researchers not doing, but it is a two-way street, right? And our data are very clear that it is a two-way street, in the sense that managers also have their jargon, and they're also sort of disciplinary, thoughts bounded by their organizational experience. So I just want to say that when we talk about implications, we want to sort of talk about for both parties.
Right.
Sometimes, to answer your questions, I think sometimes how do you prepare is like, you have to fall down and get up, in the sense that, come show up in a meeting working with your traditional ways of working, and it doesn't, nothing is happening, and you can hear crickets, and you have to care for things to change. That, okay, I'm working with practitioners and managers, and this is an opportunity. So you have to care to leverage that opportunity. And then you think about, okay, what else can I do differently? In fact, one of the things that Tima and I have been theorizing in other places is that this idea of working together, we call it co-creation, is not a snapshot. It's not that one meeting went bad or 3 meetings went bad. It's a process, right? So meetings going bad is a feature, not a bug of the process. And so research is prepared by having that process mindset that's saying that, okay, this didn't work. What can I do differently next time? I know, Tima, if you have other things to add.
I think that I think Garima's actually covered it incredibly thoroughly, and I don't have a lot more to add other than I think that managers, specifically, business, and it might be different in other arenas, but in business, people have very short attention spans and time frames. And researchers can deal with ambiguity. They don't mind uncertainty. They have a lot more time to work on stuff. And you have to get both parties with different ways of working and different attention spans to actually work together in those moments. And so I think having a process that's very well structured, so you know when you're meeting, what's expected from the whole project, what the outcomes are, and then say to people, just allow some things to emerge. That sort of sets a frame that puts a manager's concerns to rest. And they'll say, okay, we'll wait for the 8 months, and we'll meet and we'll engage for that period of time. But it's not right for everybody. And so there's some managers that get frustrated with that and they'll exit. Others just eat it up. This is what they're looking for. They're looking to really think differently and engage meaningfully. So the 2 examples that Garima gave, the baseball diamond one, was very much about the 2 groups, managers and practitioners, meeting and allowing their baggage to be left at the door to come to this place to really interact. Whereas the first one, the researchers still kept their research hat and the managers were trying to sort of access in some way, but there was just this boundary that couldn't be bridged as easily.
And another thing that we've been writing about is the sort of this really fundamental question of who has the legitimacy to produce knowledge, right? And I think our society affords legitimacy to researchers mostly, right? That I have been trained and this is how rigor happens, and sort of the whole process is opaque, to the outside world. And here are my big insights. And so in many ways, it's also this delicate balance between how do I, what Tima call like liminal space, how do I suspend that expertise for that? And then when I have to take back that expertise in terms of applying my rigorous methods, I'm sort of back at it. So, we also notice this meetings were these liminal space, but when they go back to their respective worlds, you can do a deep dive and you can sort of take on back this role of experts in their own worlds. And then when you come back, you're back in this liminal space where you're suspending that.
So when you're selecting or recruiting, engaging, the people who are going to be involved with this process, the selection of the managers, given what you've just described about kind of the mindsets and et cetera, are tips you would suggest to people watching this who are thinking about trying to engage with managers or other practitioners? What would they say? How would they explain what they're doing? And are there kind of criteria that you had for selecting managers to be a part of this process?
Yeah, so at NBS, we formed what we call the Leadership Council, and we invited managers to engage with us. And I think the pieces that we put in place really worked well. So some of the things were that we asked them to engage for 3 years. So every year there'd be 2 projects. And so that means that they would see multiple projects after the first year. They don't really know what's going on. It's right in the first year. And then after they see the outputs of the first set of projects, then they know how to engage in the second ones and they get a little bit more excited. So we asked them to engage for 3 years. We told them that they would be partnering with researchers, and there's a huge community out there of people in practice that want to be able to engage more meaningfully with researchers. They just don't know how. Just like we might not know how to reach managers, they don't know how to reach us. And so giving them that space and using the knowledge objects as the boundary to allow, you know, as the object that allows people across boundaries was really important to them. We also had clarity around our goal, which was and a process around it. So they bought into the goal, which was to help to solve real problems that they're working on with researchers, but then also having a sense of process. So we do this every year, and there's a cycle that we go through every year where you all define the questions that you want to have answered. We take 2 of them. You help decide which 2. And then we go through this process of doing the systematic review, figuring out the question, doing the systematic review, working with managers to try to build visual boundary objects, disseminating and mobilizing and having them apply, and then doing that all over again. That gave them comfort as well, that they knew that there was outputs when that would happen. And so it was actually easier than you would expect to get people at the table. The challenges came from elsewhere, but that wasn't the challenge. Getting people was relatively straightforward.
And NBS is its own machinery, and TMA and the NBS team had put tons and tons of hours and thought into that. And when I share these ideas elsewhere, usually especially early career sort of scholarship stage, I get these questions around like, what do I do as an individual researcher to be able to forge those collaborations? And, a part of me always wants to say, if you have to convince somebody to partner, it's not going to go. It's going to only gets harder, right? As I've shown you that when you start working together, it's only gets harder. So look for people who are all in, who really care about, generating knowledge. Related to that is also often a question like, how is this work different from action research? And if you think about action research, you're really solving or intervening in an organizational problem. But these people at this table in NBS projects are actually there not to solve their own organizational problem. They're literally there to generate collective knowledge for everybody in the business field. So that's a very critical difference, So if you find partners like that who are motivated by this call to action to generate collective knowledge, I think that would be the best partnership. Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that you would like to add? Tips or recommendations to our readers who are thinking about these ideas?
I don't know about tips or recommendations. I'll tell you one of the challenges that we did ultimately have was that researchers have these long time frames. We tend to stick with things for a long time. We found that the managers that were engaged, some of them would stay for the entire period, but there's so much turnover in organizations now more so than ever. And so I think keeping the same manager in the job for 3 years, that just feels so different nowadays. So I think that's I'm not sure what the answer to that problem is, other than maybe we can't ask for a 3-year commitment anymore. It has to be shorter. So I think but this is important work. My goodness, Janet, you started on this with the introduction that we're never going to solve the problems that we have today by just reviewing research that in our own silos. we need to actually work with managers to apply that work. And that has to be done in real time. And it can't be just done by systematically reviewing and putting it out there, but by having them engage with the review so that they help to mold the review,
Mhm.
sculpt the review so that it actually has meaning to them.
Right.
That's how we're going to solve some of these big world problems.
Right. Well,
Yeah,
thank you
and
so
just
much. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just want to say one last thing about impact that we didn't really talk much about, because underlying all of our effort is this idea of research impact. And, we in the review process, we were really sort of nudged and encouraged to think deeply about research impact and write about it and what our data say. And so, we went through so many different iterations, and, at the very surface level, we collected data on how many downloads, how many views of these outputs. At a more personal level, we drew on interview data, and we talked about how does this collaboration process change you as a researcher and change managers, and so the really impact is happening in real time in those meetings. And then we also talk about impact as in these managers really owning the output, in the sense that instead of researchers presenting these findings, managers were presenting these findings in industry conferences and being change agents. And so there's so many layers to sort of the impact that can be generated out of a process like this, that I just wanted to sort of put that into our conversation as well.
Right. I think, like you say, I mean, the whole process of thinking about dissemination, it goes back to your first example. Is it, well, gee, I've written my paper and published it, so like, I'm done. I'm out of here, kind of, that's where dissemination just stops, because I've got that listed on my Vita and problem solved. But, thinking more in terms of, that it's, from what you're saying, that it's not only a sharing in the process of doing this, but then sharing in the, well, what do we do with what we learned? And, taking that and sharing it and applying it in all different kinds of ways. And, while, you're talking about the business setting and managers, I think, what you've suggested here will resonate with people working in all different kinds of fields. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about this and to share your experiences. And I think they'll be, of great interest to our methods-based community.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much
for the opportunity, Janet.